The 1980s was the golden age of coming-of-age family adventure films within the science fiction genre. Flight of the Navigator was one of those films. Set in the year 1978, our story is centered around David, a 12-year-old boy living with his family in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, who while exploring the forest near his house accidentally is knocked out. He awakens only to find 8 years has passed. He is reunited with his family, who are happy to see him return to them, but are baffled to see that he hasn't aged and still looks 12 years old. Meanwhile, NASA find a futuristic spacecraft. They find out that David has a connection to this spacecraft and lock him up in a high security facility, running a lot of tests on him to find out what he knows about the ship. David escapes in the spacecraft, which is run by a funny robot named Max. Max is the only one that can return him to his own timeline. Flight of the Navigator was one of the very first times we see NASA depicted as the bad guys, as they attempt to manipulate David and hold him against his will in order to find out what he knows about the mysterious spacecraft. Despite eventually being released and distributed by Walt Disney Pictures, Flight of the Navigator actually began as an independent film project that was brought to a number of studios, including Disney, who were unable to approve the project, until an independent company, Producers Sales Organization, saw a lot of promise in the project and put up most of the money for the film. Thankfully, the rest of the money was raised by a Norwegian film company called Viking Films, who wanted to produce and release the film. Randall Kleiser was hired as the director of the project. This was the first time directing a film in the science fiction genre. He made his directorial debut with the hit musical Grease in 1978 and directed more dramatic works like the TV movie The Boy in the Plastic Bubble starring John Travolta, as well as directing The Blue Lagoon in 1980. For the role of David Freeman, child actor Joey Kramer was cast.
For casting, we saw many kids. We wanted to find a boy who could be emotional at the right times and cry. And we came across Joey Kramer, and he was perfect. On the screen test, he had real tears. Very likable kid. I knew that that was the guy. You know, we saw many kids, but he was the one that stood out.
Actor Chris O'Donnell also tried out for the part of David. Kramer already had a lot of acting experience and had just come off playing Tom Selleck's son in the techno-thriller Runaway in 1984. But it would be Flight of the Navigator, which was his biggest movie role yet, and he fits the role of David perfectly, giving a likeable performance as a somewhat naive and confused 12-year-old boy who is dealing with a very traumatizing experience. His parents in the film are played by Veronica Cartwright and Cliff DeYoung. Veronica Cartwright was definitely no stranger to science fiction, who had starred in the classic horror sci-fi film Alien in 1979 and started acting as a child star, and had starred in the classic Alfred Hitchcock film The Birds in 1962. Actor Cliff DeYoung is known for his various 80s roles in films like FX, Murder by Illusion, and the teen comedy Secret Admirer in 1985. A young Sarah Jessica Parker plays Carolyn McAdams. Prior to Flight of the Navigator, she had starred in Girls Just Wanna Have Fun in 1984 and Footloose. Matt Adler plays David's younger brother, Jeff Freeman. Adler appeared in many 80s films, especially in teen films, like Teen Wolf in 1985. Paul Rubin, better known as Pee Wee Herman, who was extremely popular in the US throughout the 80s, is the voice of Max. This was actually his first time working with Disney. Rubin agreed to do the voice of Max if he could be credited in the film as Paul Mole. His entrance partway into the film changes the tone of the film, from a serious Twilight Zone style fantasy to a fun, light-hearted, more enjoyable family adventure film. Paul Rubin, after Flight of the Navigator, would go on to do voiceover work for Disney as the robot Rex for Star Tours, the Star Wars ride at Disney World. The film cost $17.5 million to make, with principal photography beginning on the 4th of December 1985, and was mostly shot over 10 weeks in Fort Lauderdale, Florida and Los Angeles. Production was relocated to Norway for an additional 3 weeks for the interior shots, which were filmed in an airplane hangar in Oslo. 2 identical spaceships were built, with the 2 ships transported to Oslo in 4 sections that were reassembled in the airplane hangar. There would be a few production problems while filming in Norway. Director Kleiser found it especially hard working with a Norwegian stunt double for Joey Kramer, and remarked that the stunt double could not speak a word of English, so it was hard to give direction to him. This meant that capturing the scenes would take a whole day. Part of the reason why they moved the production to Norway in the final weeks was because the Viking Film Company went bankrupt over halfway into production, but allegedly had separate funds that could only be acquired in Norway. After shooting was completed, director Kleiser decided that he had to reshoot certain scenes in Florida. The special effects was an integral part of Flight of the Navigator, especially with the spacecraft effects, and the film offered some of the very first CGI effects ever caught on film. Randall Kleiser's brother, Jeff Kleiser, was hired to supervise the special effects.
My brother Jeff does visual effects and computer graphics. He's one of the first people to do that. He worked on Disney's Tron, the first CGI movie.
As I recall, when we did Tron, there were only 4 companies in the world that could put high-resolution computer animation on film. So there had not been any significant amount of computer animation put into a film before Tron. Tron was sort of the big awakening of the industry for a whole new class of imagery that's computed rather than photographed. And so Flight of the Navigator was shortly after that, so it was one of the films that came just after Tron to take advantage of some of the new development and new technology.
The effects were extremely hard and frustrating to create, mainly due to the computer crashing 5 to 6 times a day. The CGI effects were created by Omnibus Computer Animation.
But the thing was, at that time, the state of the art was really in its infancy, and there were really no ways of making computer-generated images very easily. So we were just experimenting with all the new things we could think of at digital effects.
Yes, the effects look somewhat dated today, but the effects for 1986 were state-of-the-art and would be the benchmark for CGI effects, influencing the effects for films like The Abyss and Terminator 2: Judgment Day in 1991 that would offer some of the most groundbreaking effects ever seen on film. Walt Disney Pictures made an offer which was accepted by Viking Studios and picked up the rights of Flight of the Navigator to release and distribute the film. This would be Disney's first distribution deal for the studio under new management, which was headed by Michael Eisner. The wonderful 80s style score was composed by Alan Silvestri, who during the 80s composed some of the biggest movies, including Predator and Back to the Future. Flight of the Navigator didn't make the money Disney was expecting, but the film was third at the box office in its opening weekend and opened just behind the release of films like Howard the Duck. Director Kleiser would move on to direct the fantasy Honey, I Blew Up the Kid, the sequel to the Disney hit Honey, I Shrunk the Kids. However, the film was a box office disappointment. Flight of the Navigator takes a while to get going, but once David travels in the spacecraft and meets Max, that's where the true fun begins. Flight of the Navigator, like the other classic 80s films, The Never-Ending Story and Explorers in 1985, found new life on home video, and today is a beloved cult classic, still enjoyed today, and I'm one of those who love this film. My name's Jonathan. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video and like what you see on my channel, please subscribe, and if you would like to become a patron on my Patreon, click on the link below.